Welcome to Clues to Use for Tree ID. I'm Kathy Smith, Extension Program Director for Forestry in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. Today we're going to take a look at some clues that you can use when you're trying to identify trees. Tree ID is a lot of times a process of elimination, so you're kind of looking for some things to eliminate the potential of it being one thing versus another. Sometimes it's as simple as, is it deciduous or is it a conifer? So deciduous being it will lose its leaves in the fall versus a conifer that tends to stay green all season long. We're going to take a look at branching patterns, and that includes opposite, alternate, and whorled. And I'll show you some examples of those. We're going to look at leaf types, which include simple, pinnately compound, palmately compound, and bipinnately compound. And we'll explain all of those with some images as we work through the presentation today. And last but not least, we'll pull in some other key characteristics. For some tree species, there are just some characteristics. It may be bark, it may be flowers, that once you see it, you're going to remember it. And it's one of those key characteristics that you can associate with a certain species. So one of the questions we do have to answer is, what is a leaf? So a leaf is attached to the twig where there is a bud for next year's growth. Okay, so each one of these buds you can see on the twig on the right has a leaf attached at the base of that bud. And so those are all leaves. The buds are there for next year's growth, and that helps you identify the difference usually between a leaf and a leaflet, and we'll explain that when we get to the different leaves that we're looking at. Here on the left is an image of a twig with kind of this horseshoe look at the base of the bud. That horseshoe image is where the leaf was attached. So it leaves what we call a leaf scar. So every one of these leaves, when it falls off in the fall from the twig, leaves a scar behind that sometimes can also be a key characteristic that you can use when trying to identify the tree. So let's look at leaf shapes. Here's a simple leaf, and I've highlighted some key terminology that if you're using some kind of tree identification publication, you may see these terms used to describe different tree leaves. So this is a simple leaf. If we look at the leaf margin on this one, it looks like it's got little tiny teeth, which will be called serrate or serrated edge. The petiole is the stem that is attached to the twig. So as we looked at the last image and we're looking at the buds and could see that stem that was attached right there by the bud, that's the petiole on a simple leaf. The entire thing is considered a leaf blade, and sometimes in some publications you'll see reference to leaf tip and talk about the shape of the leaf tip, and I've identified that here for you just so you understand where that is as part of a simple leaf. We then have pinnately compound leaves, and so you'll have multiple leaflets. So what you're looking at on the screen, this entire thing is a leaf, and each one of these is a leaflet. So number of leaflets play into that role of trying to eliminate what you're looking at. And so when we started looking at ash trees because of emerald ash borer, one of the things we laid out for folks was the number of leaflets for the different species, the different ash species. So green, white, black, blue, they all have a little bit different formation there. But one of the things to keep in mind is that the bud for next year's growth is down here at the base of the rachis, not up here at the base of the leaflets. And so there's no buds up here, which makes them leaflets instead of leaves. So keep that in mind. If someone brings you a leaflet to try to ID a tree from, that can be really difficult. So keep in mind that if someone's asking for help identifying something, you want this entire leaf to help you with that process. Palmately compound leaves are typically our horse chestnuts and our buckeyes. This one here in front of us is from a red buckeye. So you can see they all originate from this one point at the end of the rachis. Number of leaflets here too plays a role. So red buckeye, yellow buckeye, Ohio buckeye, and the horse chestnuts can all have varying degrees of number of leaflets. So it's crucial to know what you're looking at. And remember, the whole thing is a leaf because the bud for next year's growth is down here at the base of this rachis. And then we have bipinnately compound leaves. It may look like each one of these would be a leaf, but this entire structure you see is a leaf. Down here at the base of the rachis is where the bud would be for next year's growth. So this is critical that you see this entire thing. We typically have two trees that we talk about in Ohio that have bipinnately compound leaves, and that would be Kentucky coffee tree and honey locust. But the kicker for honey locust is they can also have just pinnately compound leaves. So they can have bipinnately and pinnately compound leaves on the same tree. So keep that in mind as you're trying to identify some of these species. When we talk about branching patterns, that's kind of one of those steps that you'll use to eliminate some species as you're thinking through the process. So remember that when we talk about branching patterns, the leaves are attached in this pattern, the twigs grow in this pattern, the buds are on the twig in that same pattern. So in this case, we're looking at an alternate patterned tree. You can see the buds alternate up the stem. You can see the leaves where they're attached alternate on the stem. And if we could see the entire tree, we would see that the twigs also alternate on the tree. So just remember that pattern. They kind of switch sides and work their way up and down the twig in that manner. So in this case, here's a good example. If you look at this twig, you can see that they alternate as they go up the stem. For this species, American sycamore, you can see that there's also a little bit of a kind of a zigzag pattern with the twig. It kind of juts out one way on the next bud and then comes back on the following bud. It has a quite distinct fruit because you'll see these little balls hanging on the tree all winter long. They really don't start to do this breaking apart and throwing of seed until we get into January and February. So most of the winter, these little balls are hanging from the tree. And if we look closer at a bud, you will see that that leaf scar that we talked about up front is here, and it actually rings the bud. So think about that. That scar is what's left when the leaf falls off the tree. And so in this case, that bud was up in the base of that petiole. So it had a swollen base on the petiole that completely covered the bud. And the evidence of that is here is the leaf scar encircling the bud. So some really great clues for trying to tell sycamore, and we didn't even look at a leaf at this one. These would be clues that especially on the twigs, it would be there all year round. You may have to dig for that leaf scar if the leaves are on. And then, like I said, the balls of fruit that are hanging there are on there in the wintertime, which are great clues for trying to tell it apart from other species. Branching patterns, again, opposite. So here are a couple of examples where this is actually a buckeye horse chestnut cross, but you can see the buds are opposite. Here's one leaf attached. Here's the leaf scar from the other leaf that were growing opposite. And if you look at the spring growth as it's coming out, these young leaves are coming out opposite. So remember though that things happen, and you could lose this bud for whatever reason, and you may have a sample that just has one bud. You may need to look at more than one spot on the tree, but these are also all great options when you're looking at something opposite. And then we have whorled. There's typically one tree, which is catalpa. We do have some northern catalpa in Ohio and some southern catalpa growing in Ohio. But the key component here is that it's whorled. There's 3 leaves coming out from the same point. Here's 3 buds. And so you have this whorled look to the tree. So no matter where, you may lose a couple of these. You can see here that this one actually looks pretty darn healthy. This one's a little weakling compared to maybe the other 2 in the size that they're growing. But 3 buds that will be there as well. And so whorled in Ohio, tree-wise, is typically catalpa. Whether it's northern or southern, there's some other things that we'd have to look for, but for the whorled aspect itself, it's one of the catalpas. Here's the leaves and the flowers. And I have to say, for catalpa, one of the easy components for me is you think everything is done flowering in the spring. Everything is kind of greened up and you think we're past the flowering stage, and you'll be driving around and you'll see these big leaved trees producing these beautiful, almost orchid-like standing flowers, and those are catalpa. And then in the fall and through the winter, you'll see the cigar-shaped seed pods hanging on the tree. So 2 very distinctive characteristics that can be used for ID. And if you add just the characteristic of the tree itself being whorled, those are all good characteristics when you're trying to ID catalpa. So we're going to look at some species and some other terminology here just to familiarize you with some things. And so this is a simple leaf. You can see the lobes. In this case, we would count 5 lobes. There's kind of these 3 big ones, a couple of small ones down here. If we look at the leaf margin, we can see the teeth. So it has a serrated leaf margin. It has this very spiny ball for fruit, and all of these characteristics. So the shape of this very lobed tree, the fruit itself being a simple leaf, this is sweet gum. Beautiful fall color would add another characteristic that you can use when you're trying to identify sweet gum. So then we look at this elm leaf. It's a simple leaf. Again, here's the petiole, doubly serrate. So what do we mean by that is we have these large teeth, and on those large teeth are smaller teeth. So it's twice serrate or doubly toothed, however you see the terminology pop up. And it has an unequal leaf base. If you look here closely, you can see that this side the tissue comes down and ends here, and on the other side the tissue comes down and ends a little farther down. One of my rules for the elm leaves is that you fold the leaf down this mid vein, fold it in half, and you'll see how unequal that leaf base at the petiole is. The seeds are these very easily airborne seeds, which is why we end up with elm. In the spring, you'll see these leaves or these seeds moving around quite a bit, and they end up finding a great spot and sprouting at least for a period of time. Then let's look at the opposites. So when we think about the opposites, there's a small group of trees that fall into the opposite branching, opposite leaf attachment, opposite buds, and that's mad buck. And it stands for maple, ash, dogwood, and buckeye, with the horse chestnut thrown in there with the buckeye. So you can see here the branching pattern is opposite, and up here is opposite. A little hard to see the buds here, but you can kind of see as you look farther down. But this is the rule of thumb. So if you're looking at a tree and you're looking at the branching pattern and you see that it's opposite, you already have a smaller group of tree species that you want to think about. Sugar maple would be one of those. Here you can see the buds. The lateral buds are opposite. The fruit in this case, these samaras, are also attached. I look more for the attachment angle than I do necessarily for the attachment itself when we're trying to ID. Each of the maples have a little bit different shape in how they're attached to each other with the seeds. Here's the sugar maple leaf, and if you look very closely back here behind it, you can see that they are opposite there as well. So one of the opposites, if you think about it, when you see something that's opposite and you think about madbuck, sugar maple is definitely one of those that we think about. So here's another example of a maple. Single leaf, a simple leaf, attached by the petiole to the twig down here. It has three very large, what you would consider dominant lobes, with a couple of smaller ones here, so you could say 3 to 5 depending on the leaf that you're looking at. The margin of the leaf has teeth, as you can see as you look around the edge. And then if you look over here at the fruit, you can see again you have the paired samaras that we just looked at on the sugar maple. And this one would be more than likely considered a red maple. And I say more than likely because in Ohio we have a tendency to have some red maple, silver maple crosses that are sometimes nicknamed rilvers, and so they have characteristics of both. I've tried to key some of these trees. Sometimes they key to red, sometimes they key to silver, but this one I would probably put more in the red category based on some of the fruit that I see. But we have to think about that, is that we might have a hybrid tree that we're looking at and there may not be grand distinction when you're trying to look at it. So you may just say that it's one of the maples. Here we have a bur oak leaf. When we start talking about the oaks, we're looking again at a simple leaf, and those oaks that fall into the white group have these rounded lobes. Bur oak has kind of this mitten shape at the top with a couple of then very deep sinuses that kind of come almost to the midvein and then flare back out and look a lot like the lobes up top. But one of the key characteristics for IDing bur oak is the leaf, but the acorn itself. This hairy capped, sometimes nicknamed mossy cup oak, is very distinctive when we start looking at our native oaks and we look at bur oak. Northern red oak would be another very common oak in Ohio. It's a simple leaf again. There's a number of lobes and then these deep sinuses. A lot of times on the oaks, the depth of that sinus or the shape of that sinus can add to the characteristics that you're looking for. But to know the difference between red and white group is the bristle hairs at the tip. So all of the oaks that fall into the red oak group have bristle hairs at the tip. And you need to remember that. Acorns are also pretty distinctive. They're a fairly large acorn with the cap just very slightly covering the top of the acorn. And if you can get acorns, a lot of times the acorns are one of the best characteristics for telling the oaks apart. Here's just an example of some of those acorns. You can see black and bur and then chinkapin. And while those look small, they are pretty small. They're probably, you know, the size of the tip of your little finger when it comes to acorns. They're one of the smaller ones. White oak, a little bit larger, kind of long. Shingle oak, you can see there, and then swamp white oak. The difference with swamp white oak is if you look at all these other ones, they're pretty closely attached to the twigs. Swamp white oak has this stem called a peduncle. So it has a stem and the acorns sit out a little farther from the twig. There is a non-native English oak that has the same characteristics on the acorns, but for our native ones, swamp white would be the one that has that extra stem, that length that puts it kind of out away from the twig, unlike some of the other ones that we looked here. But you can see how distinctive they are. And so there are some keys out there that will help you key fruit. And if you want to key acorns, that's probably one of the best ways. If you can get the acorns before the wildlife do, then you can use that as a key characteristic for the oaks. Flowers are very distinctive for most of the trees, but Some of them aren't very showy, some of them are super showy. So yellow poplar is one of those trees that has a beautiful bloom, but it's amazing, a lot of folks never see the bloom. It may sit in the top of the tree and you just find the petals on the ground and not always understand kind of where they came from. But a beautiful flower. And then if you look at the leaf, it has a very distinctive shape as well. It's a simple leaf, but it has this flat top where most of our leaves come out to some kind of point. Yellow poplar, tulip tree, tulip poplar, whatever the common name is that you're used to calling it, has kind of this flat top that we look for when we think that we're looking at yellow poplar. And there isn't another tree species you're going to find in Ohio that has that kind of leaf shape. As I said, flowers can be really distinctive, and so all three of these fall into the Aescleus group, and you've got red buckeye, you've got a horse chestnut, and you have Ohio buckeye. So these tall blooms, different flower colors, different kind of flower shapes, even when you talk about the individual blooms, but all of them are on one of these plants. The red buckeye, I'll see a lot of times that hummingbirds just absolutely love. Horse chestnut, there are a variety of horticultural varieties that have different flower colors. So you may see pink ones, you may see these kind of white with pink. There's a variety of options out there if you're buying something from a nursery. And then Ohio and yellow buckeye are very similar in what their blooms look like. One is a little more yellow, one's a little more white. But if you get late in the season, they both can have kind of that yellowish cast to them. But flowers that are very distinctive when you're trying to ID something. Some flowers that you may not be as used to seeing, so white oak blooms. Typically in the spring, if we have a huge season of oak flowers, I may get calls about the worms that are hanging from the tree. The flowers are just not super distinctive. They just kind of hang there and not showy like we think about flowers on a tree being. The center one is black locust, blooms a little later. You got leaves on already that are pretty much almost at full strength, but smell gorgeous. You know, definitely one of those. It was one of my mother's favorites. We had black locust trees growing up in the backyard, and she always just loved that time of year with the smell. And then one leaf that you may not see very often is sassafras. Sassafras have these cluster of yellow flowers at the tip, and I've had a lot of folks say they've never seen sassafras bloom, and so it is a little bit different and lasts a very short period of time. So it blooms and is gone in a relatively few days. So something to look for, but definitely a key characteristic for sassafras. We can talk about fruit. Here are the two buckeyes that we typically see in Ohio, with Ohio and yellow. Ohio having a spiny shell and a smaller nut inside, where yellow has that smooth shell, and the buckeye itself is a little bit bigger, a little bit lighter brown. Ohio buckeye, you might find a pod that has up to two, maybe three buckeyes in it, but usually one. Whereas yellow buckeye can be upwards of 5 in one of those pods and softball shaped. So sometimes it's bark that we need to think about. And so here's just some distinctive bark that once you learn this bark, you're probably going to be able to walk up to the tree and be able to use that clue right away. So river birch on the far left, and we move to American sycamore. Hackberry with these ridges on the bark, and then black cherry with kind of a chippy looking, cornflake looking bark that is very dark. And so when I went through dendrology, we used to use the terminology of burnt cornflakes or burnt potato chip like bark, because it is very dark. But all distinctive and good clues to use when you're trying to ID some things. Other clues, thorns. So we go from honey locust, which you can't miss once you see it. I don't think you'll forget it. Black locust that has paired spines or thorns. And then here is a hawthorn that's a variety of hawthorn that has some major thorns that once you see those, you're probably not going to forget those either. So thorns can be one of those clues to use. Not as common as some of the other ones we've talked about today, but definitely something that works well. And last but not least, I thought we'd go through pawpaw because there are some things here that folks never see. You may see the leaves in the woods and not think a whole lot about it, but in the spring, these beautiful blooms, they kind of hang upside down. I mean, if you look in the background, you can see they're hanging down. So it's easy to walk by them in the woods and maybe not notice them, but they are beautiful blooms. And then the fruit in the fall, sometimes called a poor man's banana. It does have a custard-like feel to it. It can be eaten and peeled just like a banana. I've done that and it's okay. It doesn't have as much flavor, I would say, as a banana. And one of the other clues to use, that if you're looking at that leaf and you think it's pawpaw, grab the leaf and crush it and you'll get the odor of green peppers, which is an awesome clue. There's not too much else out there, I think, that you're going to find that smells like that. So here's a tree that has multiple clues that can be used depending on the time of year that you're looking at the species in the woods. So hopefully that gives you some clues to use. Tree ID is a process and you have to use it or you will lose it. And so it's a case of work through it, learn some of those clues. Like I said, if you walk up to a tree and you see that dark burnt cornflake, burnt potato chip like bark, you're going to say, oh, that's a black cherry. Same way with the river birch and the sycamore. You see some of those blooms. If you see that pawpaw bloom, there isn't anything else out there that looks like it. So those are some great clues that mean you don't necessarily have to go through a whole ID booklet to try to figure out what it is. Those are just those immediate clues that can pop into your head and say, oh, I know what that is. So hopefully this has helped. If you have questions about this presentation, please feel free to email me at the contact info that you see here on the screen. And thanks for enjoying the talk.